Is there still such a thing as must-have cards for any deck in Marvel Champions, the card game? Maybe, sort of, kind of, sometimes, I think. Recently, I was thinking a bit about this because generally over the past, right, the basic double cards, Strength, Genius, and Energy, have pretty much gone into every single deck, right? It's not even something you think about, you just throw into every single deck. And when Spider came out with her 3 card hand size, a lot of people stopped putting those doubles in because she could generate so many resources. Now you can still do it, and I've done it, and it works for the most part, right? It's not a great way of doing it, but it definitely works. So it got me thinking of other cards, during this game's lifespan that were considered must-have cards, right? Just sticking with the basics, Nick Fury, right? That's still a card that I think most people put in their decks nowadays. I don't know if you need to still, but you can, right? The lower hand size heroes have a hard time with Nick Fury, but he's still a very good card. Avengers Mansion, still a really good card. Again, lower hand size heroes, it's almost needed but hard to put in, right? It's a weird kind of trade-off. And then on top of that, Helicarrier, right? Helicarrier was another big one, really important, really big. Another good card. And those are still 3 cards that even with heroes today, I will still try to put those cards in, right? It's they don't go in every single deck, but every single deck I create, I try to figure out if those cards can fit in, along with the doubles, of course. So that got me thinking of some other cards that seem to be sort of must-haves. And I kind of want to go through and kind of talk about the evolution of this and the changes of all this. And again, really quick, this is not a one-way conversation. While I'm going through this, let me know in the comments, what are some must-have cards in your Marvel Champions deck? Any aspect, right? We're going to start with basic. We're going to go through some aspects, but any aspect, what do you consider must-haves, or if must-haves even exist still? So one of the more interesting cards that came out with Black Widow was QUINCARRIER, right? A 3-cost support. And as long as you had an Avengers trait, you could exhaust QUINCARRIER to generate a wild resource. Really kind of great card, because there's a lot of heroes out there that are Avengers that couldn't generate a resource, and this was a way to do that. Now, a lot of hero-specific resource cards are only 2 cost, and so this is a little bit worse, right? Not as great, and you can't like give it to somebody else, which kind of stinks, and it's stuck to Avengers, which matters later on in the game. But I think it was one of those cards that for a long while, a lot of people were always putting in their deck, right? It made a lot of sense. It's a good enough card. And it's something that it looks like they're continuing with X-Men, right? So I like the card. It's still a card that I use probably for Avenger decks like 80% of the time. But I try to figure out if it fits in there. And if my hero already has resource generators like Captain America or someone like that, then I don't worry about it. I usually don't add that in. Now, what's kind of interesting is after that, for Ironheart, in her kit was Ingenuity, right? So it's a genius trait card, which now is a cheaper one for somebody like Bruce Banner and the Hulk, right? Works for Wasp, obviously works for Ironheart, which is a really cool 2-cost upgrade where you can generate a science resource. So if you need science resources, it's really great for that. But also, it was just a way to generate a resource. And I think it's a pretty cool card if you can get to work. It's nice that this type of card exists at a 2 cost, granted for a very specific trait type, which maybe they'll do more with later. But I also really like Ingenuity. So if I have a genius hero, this card almost always gets thrown in. Then Miss Marvel, which I still think is one of the best heroes to buy, right? That hero pack, if you're looking for some staple cards, because of the next 2 I'm going to mention, which the first one's Endurance, right? It's a 1-cost card. You can only play 1 under your control, but you get 3 hit points. And for a lot of heroes that were a 9 hit point hero, right? This boosts them up to 12, which is a good amount, right? It's a really good amount. I think for the cost, it's really good. I really like this card. And this is a card, again, especially if it's a low health hero, it gets thrown in a lot of times. Or even if it's a high health hero, but I'm not going to be doing a lot of healing with them, I'll throw this in there too. I think this card's really versatile. It's one of those cards that I seem to try to put in the vast majority of my decks. Now, also in Miss Marvel was the 1-cost upgrade Downtime, which lets you add +2 recovery to your alter ego form. Now, a lot of people have replaced this with Venom's Crew Quarters, right? In the Venom hero pack was a 1-cost support. Crew Quarters, which you exhaust that to heal 1 damage from an alter ego, which was kind of nice, right? It does kind of the same exact thing, unless you're healing twice in a row, which you're probably not. Maybe you are, but probably not. But for a lot of people, Crew Quarters replaced Downtime. They're both not interchangeable, but they're both good cards to kind of take a look at and see how you're going to heal on the Ultra Ego side if that's how you're healing the game, right? So I'm a big fan of that card as well. As far as basics go, that's kind of the things that stick out in mind. Now, again, with the Spider Web Warrior cards that come out, there's a lot more basic cards that are in the Web Warrior universe that are almost considered like must-haves, right? Even with Champions cards, where Champions Mobile Bunker and Go for Champions or whatever, that are pretty much not guaranteed must-haves, but you would look really into those cards almost every single time, right? So this, again, is very, very broad, but we're starting to get to a point in the game where you're starting to look at, okay, if they have a Champions trait, right? If they have a Genius trait, right? If they have Web Warrior trait, then you go into like a whole nother subsection of cards, which kind of shows how maybe for basic, the idea of must-have cards is kind of breaking down, or it's breaking down by trait, I guess is what I should say. It's not what it used to be where you guarantee put in every single time. All right, so I want to kind of go into like aspect cards, which is really kind of weird because in all the aspects now, there's so many different ways to do things, right? Like with protection, I think is a perfect example. There's so many ways to play protection now, right? Leadership, there's a good amount of ways. Justice is a good amount of ways. Aggression, there's some ways, right? There's almost no such thing as a universal like must have this card in whatever the aspect is, right? And I still think there's certain cards I look at the vast majority of the time. I just want to make note of them. But again, these aren't must-haves, I think. I think they're the first cards I really look at that can work for most kind of builds. One of the ones that really pops out for aggression, we'll start there, is Hulk, the Hulk ally card, which is kind of weird because it came with the core set. It's not a great attacking card, and I don't use it for that. I use it as a blocker. He has 5 health, and a lot of the time, especially early on in the game, or if you're playing standard, Hulk can survive a 5 hit, right? Generally speaking, he will probably take 3 or 4 damage, but can survive, which means you can get a blocker for 2 rounds in a row, which is usually really nice. So I don't use Hulk as a blocker. I'm sorry, I don't use Hulk as an attacker. I use Hulk as a blocker, which I don't think is the way most people used to use him back in the day. I feel like most people passed him over because he was so bad with like his whole you discard a card and whatever the resource is, like deal 2 damage to enemy, cool, deal 1 damage to each character, discard Hulk, not great. Right? So it's kind of one of those weird cards. Then there's also cards when I have certain heroes, I look at those cards. So for example, I want to shout out Wasp because in the Discord, we've been talking about Wasp a lot. If you're not part of our Discord, you should be. We've been talking about Wasp a lot recently. And a card that I really like with Wasp is Moment of Triumph. The reason being is because after you attack and defeat an enemy, heal 1 damage from your hero for each point of excess damage dealt by that enemy, or to the enemy by that attack. Now, she has, I think it's Pinpoint Strike, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. That basically lets you do like 7 or 8 attack damage when you're in small form, and it's overkill. So if you're dealing a 1-2 damage minion, you can heal for 6 and still hit the villain for 6 more. Like, it's a crazy combo to me. So it's a card, Moment of Triumph, that I will use a fair amount with her. Now, it's not every single time, but if I'm doing Wasp Aggression, it's a card that I will almost always look at. And that's another thing I just want to point out really fast is there are certain cards with certain heroes that you just tend to look out for. Drax has a few of these with protection, right? With lowering the attack of your enemy, but still getting attacked. So anyway, that's another thing I want to point out is when we talk about this list, there are certain cards for heroes, and that's maybe a video for another day, but I just want to give a quick example of that. Moving on to Justice, there are certain cards I play a lot of Justice. It's probably my most played aspect. I don't know if it's my most liked, but it's definitely probably my most played. And there's certain cards that every single time I build out my Justice deck, especially for true solo, there's I think must-have cards. And Under Surveillance, a 2-cost upgrade where you can attach the main scheme, max 1 per scheme, increase the threat value of 4 on that main scheme. And I think this is really, really good because it doesn't scale, right? So for multiplayer, it's not as good, but for true solo, it's almost a must-have if you're playing Justice. Now, you don't have to, of course, right? But most of the time, this is one of the first cards I look at in Justice that I throw into a deck. I really like this card. I think it really helps out because I do need to flip down a lot of times in solo, and it gives me a little bit more of that buffer room, especially, if you figure let's say yeah, the main threat has 12 right on it, and you're adding up to 16. That's what, like a 30 whatever percent chance, or a 30% increase, or 33% increase, whatever it is. I'm not great with math, but it's a decent increase, right? That's what I'm trying to say, is it's a good increase, and I really like under surveillance. Going along with that, there's two events that always I tend to look at, and I've been using less and less of them. But they are cards I look at right away, and that is multitasking and clear the area. Now, multitasking is a 1 cost, remove 2 threat from scheme. If you use a science resource, you can remove 2 threat from a different scheme. I think for 1 cost, is really great to possibly remove 4 threat total, 2 and 2. I like that a lot. I think that's a pretty decent card. Clear the area is also a 1 cost, remove 2 threat, but if you remove the last 2 threat, you get to draw a card. Now, generally speaking, with side schemes or the main scheme, your threat is generally much lower. For solo, this card makes a lot more sense. For multiplayer, when your threats are probably not going to go to 0 that much, or you're not going to remove the last threats as likely to, right? Or it's easy being able to. This card doesn't make as much sense. And then there's also cards like Skilled Investigator that I really like, where after a side scheme is defeated, exhaust Skilled Investigator and you get to draw a card. It's a 0 cost upgrade. Now that works really well with something like one way or another, right? You search the encounter deck for a side scheme, reveal that side scheme, and you get to draw 3 cards. So you can get that side scheme out there. You can go after that side scheme with something like Clear the Area, and then you use Skilled Investigator to also draw a card, right? There's some fun combos you can do there. I will also say when I play Justice with Guardian Heroes, Think Fast tends to be a card I use like a ton. And I've kind of backed off of it a little bit, but when I started doing my Justice group build, this was a card that was pretty important, because I'd rather take the 1 damage, lose the 1 counter to be able to flip down to confuse the villain. Now, as more villains get stalwart and whatnot, or steady, this card is obviously not as good as it was, but it still can be helpful and can be pretty good. So that's a card that I've been using a lot recently. Excuse me. Counterintelligence, if I remember correctly, is another card. I forgot to put that on my list, but Counterintelligence is another card I really like. It's the one where if you can reduce the amount of threat put on a scheme by 3. I think that's Counterintelligence. Hopefully I got that right, and I'll see in post. That's another card that recently in Justice I've really started to like, especially when I can't confuse the villain. It's a great way to flip down and kind of negate some of the thwarting the villain could do, and that's slowly becoming a card that almost ends up in all my Justice decks. And the last one for Justice, I know I've spent a lot of time with it, I really like Justice, is Overwatch. It's not a must-have. It's not a must-have, but it is one that's starting to make more and more sense as more and more villains are putting out more and more side schemes, right? So Overwatch is, when any amount, or you attach to a scheme, sorry, and when any amount of threat is removed from the attached scheme by a thwart, discard this card, remove an equal amount from a different scheme. So that could be the main scheme, it could be a different scheme, whatever it is. Cards like Overwatch, it's not a guarantee, but if I'm playing against a villain where there's a bunch of side schemes, or there's always going to be at least one side scheme out there, this is a card I would start to look at more often. So those are all my Justice cards that I tend to look at first, and I see if it makes sense to my build, and if it doesn't make sense, then we flip them in and out. But those are the things I tend to look at the most. So let's go through leadership really fast, because there's a handful of cards, because I've been playing a lot of leadership recently, that really kind of stick out. And for example, Make the Call is a classic one, right, from the core set. You pay the printed cost of an ally in any player's discard pile, put the ally into play under your control. Really great card, because a lot of times, for leadership, I use my allies as blockers, or I have a ton of allies, so I can't really, use all of them. So I have to use some of them as resources to pay for other allies. So it's great that I can always pull them back out. So I'm a big fan of Make the Call. In there in the core set also is Maria Hill. And this works well with Make the Call, because Make the Call says, put the ally into play. And then after Maria Hill enters play, right? Just enters play. Each player draws 1 card, which is pretty cool, right? Works pretty well. So, and she's a 2 cost, 2 thwart, 1 attack, 2 health. So yeah, core set Maria Hill, sorry. I've always really enjoyed Maria Hill. She's one that I generally put in, not all the time though, because she's a shield, and we'll get into why that's important later. Also with Captain America, it came Squirrel Girl, and after she enters play, deal 1 damage to each enemy. Again, kind of working with Make the Call here, because she's being put into play. And let's see, 2 cost, 1/1, 2 ally. I think it's really, really good. It's a card team tend to look at a lot. The reason I made the comment about the Avenger trait versus Shield trait is because Mighty Avengers is a card that I use more and more now, especially with Avengers Hero. So it's a team card, and I really like this card. It's a 3 cost. If each of your characters has the Avenger trait, each ally you control gets +1/+1 thwart an attack. This is huge, right? Especially if you get this card out early on, and you're looking at a Squirrel Girl now being a 2/2, or Maria Hill being a, or not Maria Hill, but a Squirrel Girl being a 2/2, or like Ant-Man, Hank Pym, I think. But Ant-Man being he was a 2/2 and then he becomes a 3/3, right? Like that's kind of huge. That's really, really good. I really like that. So that's a big one. Rapid Response is a card that I seem to take a look at most of the times because it allows me to quickly get my allies in after they just got defeated by an attack, right? So it's a 2 cost upgrade. After an ally you control is defeated, discard Rapid Response, put that ally into play, but it gets 1 damage onto it, which I'll take that trade every single time. Going right along with that, Team Training, because I'm playing so many allies, seems like an important card. So each ally you control, you get +1 hit points, max under each hero. And then lastly, one other core ally that I used to play all the time, and he's slowly fading back, and this is another one I'm interested in if you all do, is Hawkeye, Clint Barton's Hawkeye, because of the counters, right? It's just nice that he has that response after a minion enters play, you can do 2 damage. And even if it's just to knock off the tough, I still think this card has a lot of value to him. So it's a card I use probably a ton at this point still, but maybe he's falling out of favor. I don't know. I have to think about that now. But I guess if the villain doesn't have any minions or very few minions, I would probably not use Hawkeye, but I still like him. I still like him a lot. All right, last is Protection. And here's the thing with Protection. I'm not good at Protection. I don't play a lot of Protection. So there's very few cards that really stand out to me. But there are some. I think in the classic sense, Iron Fist was one that stood out for most people. He's kind of an expensive ally, but he was a way to deal damage and stun an enemy. Right? Deal 3 damage to an enemy. You take off the Mystic counter. You have 2 of them on there. You can stun the enemy and deal 1 damage to it. It's pretty cool, right? So it'd be 3 damage total. I think obviously, with Star or whatnot, this isn't as strong as it used to be, but it's really, really nice that you had this option really kind of early on the game, right? Doctor Strange was an early hero. So it was nice early on that Protection could stun villains or minions or whatever need be. One of the other things I want to mention is some of the upgrade cards that seem to be coming out that are must-haves, maybe. And for example, like Unflappable, right? After you defend against an attack and take no damage, exhaust Unflappable, deal 1 or draw 1 card. Protection isn't all about defense anymore and like defending. There's different ways to kind of play Protection now, which is really interesting. And again, I'm not super versed in Protection, but there are more and more ways to kind of play it. I mean, I've seen people come up with a whole healing decks and being more aggressive and just doing like energy barriers to like block and whatever, but being an aggressive Protection deck, it's pretty cool. But it seems like a lot of times when people play basic Protection, they're playing to defend mainly. So cards like Unflappable are really good. Indomitable, right? Where you can discard that to ready up your hero, which is really nice. Or Hard to Ignore, and it's another take no damage card, and you remove 1 threat off the main scheme, which is really nice to kind of keep that down. The last card I want to mention is one of my favorite things for Protection, which is Flow Like Water, right? I really like Flow Like Water. I think for anytime you play defense card, right, you deal 1 damage to the attacking enemy. I think it's really cool because it can kind of keep comboing because there's no limit to it. I really like Flow Like Water, and if I'm obviously making a specific deck around a card, it's a must-have. That's a perfect example of like I would build my deck like I have in the past with Captain America, Flow Like Water Captain America deck, built it all around this 1 card. So obviously it's a must-have if you do that type of building. So I know this video was kind of, I don't know, all over the place, but try to cover all the aspects and a lot of things all at once. And that's why I think it's really important if you could scroll down, obviously hit subscribe, hit like, all that fun stuff, but leave a comment. Let me know what you think are must-have cards or cards that you built around. I think that's pretty cool too, that's becoming a bigger and bigger thing that you can build around those cards. And then lastly, I just want to quickly mention that if you want to support this channel and support these videos and help make them better, I do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/D20 Woodworking. I'll put the link down below. Make sure to check it out. I really appreciate it. And if you want to watch me use these cards live, make sure to go over to twitch.tv/D20 Woodworking to watch me play Marvel Champions and some other stuff live. We're always playing over there, so make sure to follow me there. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope you like this video. I hope you like these lists, and maybe this helps you out if you're struggling on what to put in there. Or maybe it gives you some ideas or inspirations. I don't know. But like I said, leave some comments down below because I'm really interested in what other people consider must-haves or cards they at least very strongly consider each time for that aspect.